Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Big Ideas on the Go. We're excited to have as our guest today, Nishant Bhajaria, somebody who I've known for almost 6 years now. So thrilled to have him as a guest to talk a little bit about what he's doing in data privacy engineering and just data privacy more broadly. So Nishant, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, Nishant, you and I first met when you were at Nike, and I know you've kind of transitioned from Nike to Netflix to Google, and today you're at Uber as head of privacy engineering. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your journey in the privacy domain and how you got to Uber and what you do there.
Yeah, so at Uber, I had privacy engineering. I report to the chief information security officer of the company. And I think your acquaintance with me has run parallel with how this field and how this domain itself has changed. So when I was at Nike back in the day, and we were doing a lot of good work at Nike, but fundamentally the field was seen more as a reactive, let's stop bad stuff from happening. Now it has shifted left. And I know Nimrod, your co-founder at BigID, often talks about shift left. The domain itself has shifted left. We're now not just doing deletion and privacy controls at the tail end of the process. We're now moving on the far left. We're trying to make sure that we catch designs and specs early in the process. We're trying to categorize data early. We're trying to get a sense of how do we make sure that the user is at the end of our thinking process at the very, very beginning before data comes into the company. So there's a lot more automation, there's a lot more dashboarding, there's a lot more working with the policy, legal teams to ensure that the engineers are part of that conversation. So I've been pretty fortunate in the sense where somebody like me who has this rather eclectic profile where I'm part engineer, part product, part policy, part regulatory expert. People like me have been sought after a lot more simply because of how much the risk and the awareness around privacy engineering has grown.
Yeah, and I know under kind of GDPR, they kind of coined a phrase around privacy by design, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this idea that privacy should be baked into everything you do as opposed to kind of a post-factual event that occurs after you've already built your software. So now you've actually written a book
Yeah.
on privacy by design. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the book and maybe for the audience, explain or elaborate on what privacy by design is.
Yeah, so I'll answer the GDPR question first. So the privacy by design phrase is kind of open-ended. That's how it was supposed to be. Initially, privacy by design meant how do you make sure that the products have privacy in them, which was interpreted to mean that before something goes out the door, let's make sure privacy is part of the actual design. And that typically meant that the poor legal team in the company was asked to make sure that unless privacy controls were in the design, something wouldn't ship. So you make the legal team the bad folks where they have to block something that is not privacy aware enough. What we've done over the course of time, especially what we are doing at Uber right now, is making sure that privacy controls are part of the design before something is conceived. So when engineers, product managers across the company build something, when it's a whiteboard idea, my team goes and talks to them and makes sure that we embed our controls into their architecture before something gets written. So right before code is written, right before the spec is written, we make sure that we help them out. Additionally, my team writes tools and controls, for example, for deletion, for extraction, for consent. We write central tools that engineers across the company can use. So engineers are not going to make privacy by design decisions when you just tell them. They simply don't have that kind of time. So having tooling, having dashboards, having controls, having standards, having guidance sessions, having consulting resources available for them across the development pipeline is to me what privacy by design means. And that kind of gets to the book. When people try to staff for privacy, when people try to buy tooling for privacy, it is very hard to bring BigID into the conversation or build tools within the company unless you have engineers within the company who understand what privacy basically means. So this book is about taking your internal engineering resources or using the vendors you have, vendors like BigID, and making sure that there is an understanding of what it takes from a policy perspective and a tooling perspective to automate privacy across the board. So that's what the book is about. When you want to transition your on-prem storage to cloud, for example, there are lots of resources available for AWS and Azure, things like that, right? When you want to make sure that you move from a traditional waterfall model to a full DevOps model, there are resources and runbooks available for that. But until now, I have yet to see a privacy engineering runbook. That's what this book is about. It's a book that will help your engineers, your architects, your managers, your policy, legal experts, all the way through the pipeline, build privacy into the process. At the end of the day, it's about protecting yourself, your customers, making sure that you're compliant. And this book serves as the regulatory runbook abstraction for engineers to ensure that privacy instrumentation works across your company. So the book answers both the GDPR question and the more modern automation question.
And so kind of in a related subject, you talked about the fact that you're kind of building a set of shared services in the architecture. So maybe talk a little bit about how this kind of by removing the traditional burden around this kind of regulatory issue, you kind of help around innovation, right? You help teams focus on what they're best at. So maybe you could talk to that a little bit.
Absolutely. So let me give you an example since it's going to be tax season soon, anyways. You don't have a software to help you file taxes in the US for the US federal government. You have a separate, if you had a separate software tool to file taxes for the state of California, if you're like me and you have property in another state, let's assume you have to use a third tax software to file taxes for that state. That would be very, very hard to manage. That would be almost impossible, in my opinion. You use TurboTax or some tax software, which may or may not be great, but at least it captures every single use case. So TurboTax in this case serves as an abstraction to cover 3 or 4 different use cases. Similarly, privacy engineering in terms of the tooling, in terms of the reviews, in terms of the consulting, it has to cover multiple use cases. You cannot possibly have software that applies to GDPR, CCPA, ISO differently across the board. So what I'm advocating is sort of an internal data handling standard, an internal inventory classification standard that applies across your stack, left to right, top to bottom, in a way that essentially ensures that every siloed engineering team, every microservice is covered by it. It also means the same privacy engineering platform will cover GDPR, CCPA, et cetera. Now, you may not cover every single use case. It may be that you have a couple of bespoke instances here or there, but as much as possible, if you can reconcile and consolidate a bunch of use cases into one perimeter capability, that will A, make your engineering work a lot more efficient. B, it'll make it easy to ensure an audit that you have covered all these use cases. And C, will ensure that you can prove that you've done so. Because at the end of the day, your customers will want to see something that is visible to them, that is verifiably privacy centric. That will make your audits go much faster as well. So privacy today is not just compliance, right? It's compliance plus trust. So you do the work for compliance at a minimum, and then you can optimize that for a customer facing trust narrative that'll help you prove that you genuinely care about your customers. Because so far, privacy like security has been like a counterfactual. You have to prove that privacy works correctly, but the only weapon available at your disposal is, hey, nothing bad happened. Now it's a lot more than that. You have to prove that nothing bad happened, and you're doing your best to prevent something bad from happening this point going forward.
So kind of also kind of related to this topic, and something that I think Uber in particular has more challenges because you're a global company, is how do you accommodate kind of diversity or variation in regulations? You mentioned GDPR and CCPA as two examples. So how do you accommodate that, and also changes to the regulatory landscape?
Yeah, so I every time I've given a speech like this one or a conversation like this one, Dimitri, I love talking about the horizontal funnel. Think about the narrow end on the left-hand side and the broad end on the right-hand side. What a lot of companies do, and this is what we did back in the day when you and I talked at Nike back like 7 years ago, is that you approach data at the right-hand side when data is static, when it sits in some warehouse someplace, and that's where you can ensure that the data protection controls are applied to it. And what that means is anytime you have changes to be made, they happen at the tail end of the repository, which is great, assuming the data doesn't change a whole lot, which is great, assuming that you have a finite number of internal customers for the data, and which also is fine, assuming that the data size is somewhat normal. Those assumptions have not fared well with the spinning of time, right? You have a lot more engineers accessing data. You have a lot more regurgitation of the data. You have copies being made of the data. And of course, the regulations change in the fact that GDPR may not change per se, but the narrative keeps changing. And you might be looking at state by state privacy laws across the board. So that makes it very complicated. So what I'm advocating is let's shift left again. Let's intercept data at the point of ingress. Let's label data based on privacy risk. Let's build your ML AI models based on what you know about the data at that early stage. And then let's progressively make decisions around access control, around sharing, around obfuscation, around differential privacy, around encryption, all the way across the pipeline, rather than waiting at the tail end. Because if you wait at the tail end with today's volumes of data, with the level of dissemination of the data we're seeing, it's very, very difficult to track what happened and where. It's a bit like shutting your front door after the dog's already left, right? That's not going to serve you very well. So the way you apply to these variations, the way you apply to this constant change is by arresting their data early on in the process, tagging it, and then being able to track it across the board. And that tracking enables you to then map the data to the privacy controls based on the risk inherent to the data at that point in time.
And how much of that is automated versus how much of that is manual today?
Well, it's a work in progress. There's a fair bit of automation, but it's a bit like the numerator increases when you have more automation, but
Yeah.
so does the denominator because the amount of data also increases. What is fundamentally challenging is the same actions that made us very, and when I say us, I mean the tech industry, made us very potent when it came to innovation, hurt us with security and privacy, allowing engineers to operate in silos, not having a whole lot of process, giving them access to their own tech stacks, giving them access to their own S3 buckets. That made engineers very, very independent. That made them free from the yoke of IT, so to speak. But now it means when you have to understand what engineer A does, engineer B does, all the way through engineer Z, it's very, very hard to do because everybody moves so fast. So automation is something that is always growing, but so is the need for it, and so is the delta between what's automated and what's not. So the key is, again, I go back to this early on, is access and tag data early on in the process, because what that means is you can now track that data much faster. Your ability to locate it, your ability to access the metadata, and your ability to adapt the privacy automation like deletion, like obfuscation on the go is much faster, because you are not doing it for everything at the tail end of the process in the warehouse. You're doing it at individualized levels. So what I'm telling people is, just as you've given engineers the ability to run their platforms individually in a bespoke fashion, you want to apply privacy in that fashion as well. Except what you're doing is you're doing it using your knowledge about the data that you gleaned early on in the process. So to answer your question, the automation is there, but it is something that you will have to adapt on an ongoing basis rather than just doing it once and forgetting about it. That's where the TurboTax analogy breaks down, because TurboTax works the same way across the board. What we're saying is, let's automate it early in the process, and then let's use that knowledge to innovate and adapt across the board as the platform moves forward.
Yeah, and I like the kind of the narrative around labeling. I think that was a very effective model in security to identify risk early, whether it's structured data in a catalog or unstructured data through kind of tags, and doing similar for privacy and privacy risk makes a ton of sense. I'm curious, as you kind of look at the landscape and in terms of kind of what you hear from your legal teams, what has your attention in terms of kind of the emerging, I don't want to say threat landscape, but regulatory landscape in privacy?
I think the threat landscape remains what it always has been, which is which is making sure that the laws that come in are not very prescriptive, right? At the end of the day, if you look at GDPR, if you look at CCP, I doubt that there is a very, very clear checklist anywhere in the laws. I haven't read the whole thing, and I'm not an attorney, so I don't offer legal advice. But I'm fairly certain that if you are a new company today, if you are where I was at Nike back in the day with my team, my ragtag team at the time, it is very hard to look at these regulations and come up with a very clear, discrete set of steps as to do these things, and you're fine. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you have a platform across the board that has as much redundancy as possible. But secondly, you want to make sure that the legal team and the eng team shape these things together. So whether at Nike, at Netflix, elsewhere, and Uber, I've made sure that my teams work with the legal teams on an ongoing basis to shape these specs for our privacy controls. So how do we delete data? How do we build the DSAR automation capability? You want to make sure that the attorneys at least understand the engineering choices here. They understand what some of the vocabulary means. And the engineers who typically report into me have to understand the actual implications of doing something one way or the other. So the separation we've historically had between the engineers and the attorneys is breaking down, and thank goodness for that. And some of the best attorneys I've worked with tend to be the ones that have a sense and judgment about how the engineering aspect works. So that's the other aspect. The threat landscape is constantly evolving, and so does the knowledge about the engineering and the privacy domain within the company. So we're not going to get to a point anytime soon where you can just do one thing and say privacy is done, which we're simply not. The threat alongside security keeps growing. Internal access, bad actors on the internal side, misuse of data, not having encryption covered all the way from end to end, as Zoom found out early on in the process. It all comes back to the volume of data and the sheer capabilities that the engineers bring to bear.
So, on a very related matter, you and I have known each other for about 5 years. We talk about some of the changes in terms of kind of shift left, trying to capture things earlier in the process by engineers, either through automation or manually. Over the last kind of 5 years is one of the key trends, this kind of shift towards privacy engineering. What do you think the next 5 years heralds?
I think the next 5 years heralds something very interesting where you might see for the first time academic institutions offering coaching in privacy engineering. People often tell me it's very, very hard to find privacy engineers, and I was not one before. I had to sort of learn on the fly. For the first half of my career as a privacy engineer, I didn't know what I was doing. Well, I wouldn't say quite that way, but I wouldn't know that what I was doing was definitively privacy engineering, because I was merely reacting to things that were happening. And in doing so, over time, a critical mass of knowledge built in. And then around that critical mass of knowledge, the regulatory estate followed as well. So you had the initial regulatory push create people like me, and then our ideas have since influenced the conversation a bit more. And now the regulations speak to what we do as well. So there's been this relationship that has been built where the engineering and the regulatory movements sort of happen a little more in sync than they were in the past. It's nowhere close to what it needs to be, but we're getting in a better place. But I feel like schools are going to be coaching a lot more for privacy engineering. And in fact, companies will have privacy engineering coaching within their institutions as well. If you can coach people for anti-bribery, for security training, there is no reason why you can't coach your existing engineers for privacy engineering. So one of my former colleagues at Uber had a blog post recently on LinkedIn, and she made an interesting point where when you are solving for privacy engineering, you are solving for software engineering problems that fix a privacy goal in the end. So my advice to companies is take the engineers you have, coach them, and make them privacy engineers, because it's very hard to find somebody in the domain, in the industry, that has sufficient privacy engineering experience. So if you're looking for somebody with 5+ years of privacy engineering experience, chances are they work for either Google, Facebook, Uber, or companies like us. So for the vast majority of the companies that are just now waking up to this threat, it is very, very critical that they either hire somebody with that domain knowledge or build that domain knowledge internally. So that is the purpose behind my book. That is the purpose behind the certification that is coming up, emerging from my book. But one way or the other, no matter what vehicle, what platform, you could use BigID as well. So there are options available, but it is very critical that you take your engineering talent within the company as it stands and train those engineers. Those engineers will train other engineers. They will also train the attorneys, and your program will mature overall. I feel like that's where the industry is going, because we're not going to get anywhere by waiting for the laws to be prescriptive enough to sufficiently tell you how to address risk.
And for those in our audience that wanna have a kind of starting point to work privacy engineering, where do they actually get your book?
Well, so there is a link I've shared that's on Manning Publications. If you Google me and search privacy or data privacy, I have a pretty uncommon name, thank goodness, in this case. So search for Nishant Bhajaria and data privacy. The book should come up. It's on my LinkedIn as well. I would recommend looking at the book. There's also the iconic book Michelle Dennedy wrote, The Privacy Engineer's Manifesto. So I don't want to just toot my own book, but there's other resources as well. But there's also going to be a certification coming up from my book in the month of January that Data Protocol is sponsoring. That should be helpful as well. So there's a ton of resources. But I would also recommend for companies that are totally lost, look at your internal security teams. This is what I did early on in the process when I was at Netflix. Your security teams within the company have tools for encryption, access management. All you have to do initially is to repurpose those tools from a pure security vantage point to privacy as well. So there are multiple places to start. And my advice to the chief privacy officer, CISO, landscape within the company is there is a lot to do here. It's not going to be easy, but you can get started. Don't assume that the problem is not solvable. The problem with privacy engineering, Dimitri, is that people have either assumed it's very easy and they'll get to it later on and made a mistake that way, or they have assumed it's too difficult and they get paralyzed and then they don't know where to start. That's another mistake. I would say start with the tools that you have and see what you can do with them first. Once you start building stuff, you will start understanding what the risk landscape within the company looks like. And before you know it, it's a bit like running on the treadmill. Your joints will get looser, your momentum will get stronger, you'll start catching on with the rhythm of the music a little bit more, and you will get better at it. So I would say starting small is better than not starting at all. And of course, my book's there to help, and I'm available on LinkedIn as well to offer advice when I can.
Start small before you go big. I like the sound of that.
Yeah,
Nishant, thank you very much for joining us. Always a pleasure to catch up and talk with
definitely.
you. And for those of you in the audience that want to have a listen to this again, you get please encourage all of you to subscribe to the podcast and please leave comments. And again, if you're interested in Nishant's book, just search his name and you'll be able to download it or buy it at your favorite bookstore. So thank you, everybody, and we will talk to you in the new year.
Thank you.